All right, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Pat Kane, Public Programs and Visitor Services Coordinator here at the Museum of the Grand Prairie, part of the Champaign County Forest Preserve District. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us this morning, whether you're watching live or potentially watching the recorded version of this final program in a series of virtual programs we've conducted over the last several weeks, giving you a closer look at our upcoming special exhibit titled A History of Healing Infectious Diseases and Community Responses to Defeat Them. I want to give a special thank you to our guest today, Mark Hanson, who will join us in a few short moments to discuss house calls, the theme for today's Closer Look program. Again, these programs provide a closer look at an upcoming special exhibit, A History of Healing Infectious Diseases and Community Responses to Defeat Them. This exhibit will open this Saturday during our regular business hours here at the museum, where we'll be open from 1 to 5 p.m. And then we'll be open, of course, after that as well. The exhibit will focus on the local and worldwide impact of such diseases as the 1918 flu, smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, polio, cholera, HIV/AIDS, COVID-19, and a whole bunch more inside that exhibit space. In addition to examining the impact disease has had on our health and well-being, the exhibit will highlight particular instances in the past as well as the present where local citizens came together during previous epidemics and pandemics for the betterment of their communities. So come on out and check out this exhibit, whether when it opens this Saturday for the first time or after that. Check out this special exhibit here at the Museum of the Grand Prairie. Before we get into today's program, just want to go over a few other things before we get started. Let us know where you're watching from down in the comments section below. Write your location if you're comfortable sharing that. Always love to see where folks are tuning in from when watching these virtual programs. Also, should you have any questions during the course of today's program, feel free to put those down in the comment section and we'll address those as best as we possibly can throughout the program. Lastly, you can learn more about us at the Museum of the Grand Prairie and the Champaign County Forest Preserve District by finding us on social media or visiting museumofthegrandprairie.org or ccfpd.org. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest for this morning, presenting today's program, House Calls, Mark Hanson. Mark, hey, how you doing?
Doing all right, Pat. How are you?
Doing good. Thank you, Mark, for joining us this morning, presenting the program on House Calls. So I will let you take it away, Mark.
Sure. Well, today we don't think of a doctor coming to our house very often. Usually we're going to the clinic or going to the hospital. But in the 19th century and 20th century, well into the 20th century, actually, it was very common for doctors to come to your house. There really were no, in the early days of settlement in Champaign County, there were no hospitals. Sometimes there weren't even any doctors. And so if you had a health emergency, you either needed to take care of it yourself or you needed to send for the doctor so the doctor could come to you. No phones early on, certainly no 911, no fire departments or paramedics. And so the doctor, if you were lucky enough to have one in your area, sort of had to serve all of those purposes. If there was an emergency, you would send for the doctor. There are a couple of additional reasons of why it made sense for doctors to come to patients and patients not go to the doctor. And one of the biggest ones is transportation. Most people didn't have means of transport. Roads weren't good. And so if you were walking or had to ride a horse, hitch up your wagon, transportation just wasn't easy for folks. And if you were ill or hurt, there's every likelihood that you couldn't go to the doctor even if you wanted to. So the doctor had to come to you. Early on, of course, doctors would travel on horseback with their equipment in saddlebags. But pretty quickly, a wheeled vehicle was deemed sort of the easiest, most effective way to quickly get to patients who are in need. This picture here shows one of the buggies from our collection. It's not a doctor's buggy per se. It was actually purchased by a Civil War veteran later in his life, early 1900s. And he drove this buggy to church and to town in his later years. But it's it would be very typical of perhaps what a doctor's buggy might look like. Doctors wanted something that was relatively small and light, fast, and easy to maneuver. And these smaller buggies fit that bill. There's just enough space in the behind the seat for his bag. And so he could quickly get to and from patients who might need him. In the literature, we also see sometimes a doctor's buggy called a phaeton. Phaeton was the son of the Greek god Helios, who begged his father to drive the chariot of the sun. His father acquiesced, let his son drive the chariot, which he could not control. And as legend goes, he burned some places the earth where he got too close and then froze others where he got too far away. And that's one of the reasons we have deserts and colder places on the planet. And wound up making such a mess in his ride that Zeus had to strike him down with a thunderbolt so that Helios could get control of the chariot and put things back to normal. What does that have to do with the doctor's buggy? Well, these doctor's buggies tended to be very fast, very lightweight, and also potentially very dangerous. So I think that sometimes we hear of a doctor's sports car of the day. So, Pat, if we could go to the next picture. Today, if we need medical attention at our house, we probably would call 911, and paramedics would come with an ambulance, and they've got all kinds of equipment and supplies in the back of their ambulance. For a doctor making house calls, this was it. This was his, this is a doctor's bag from our collection. Sometimes they're called Gladstone bags. So everything he would need to potentially treat everything from a broken arm to pneumonia to cancer, you name it, he would try and have everything he needed in this bag. And it would basically go everywhere he went on his house calls. Pat, if we flip to the next image. So this is what the inside of this particular bag looks like. Kind of opens up like a tackle box with compartments and a pretty big well in the center for all kinds of supplies. And so obviously these doctors were what we would call today sort of general practitioners. They needed to know basically how to do a little bit of everything. Like I said, from broken arms to cuts to pneumonia, helping during childbirth. They had to know a little bit about everything to take care of their patients. And by today's standards, you wouldn't think you'd be able to get much in this bag. Medicine has come a long, long ways where it almost seems surreal to think that a doctor could actually do all of those things with what he could fit in this bag. So what happened that caused house calls to sort of drift out of popularity? There are still house calls done today, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But as a general rule, we don't hear of that too often anymore. Several things happened. Perhaps the first was the advent of the automobile. Pat, if we want to go to the last image. So when the automobile started to become popular, doctors got right on board. Much easier than dealing with a buggy and a horse. They could do their house calls in an automobile. This photo here happens to be Dr. Dan Cole. He was a doctor in Rantoul, early 1900s. And we see him here in his brush automobile with his dog. And his wife is standing in the yard. And it might be hard to see, but in the very far right-hand side of the photo, you'll see a sign on a tree. And that's his the sign for his office. He actually had an office in his home where people could come and see him at his home. So this photo sort of represents a shift. When automobiles enter the scene, everyone begins to have easier means of transportation. With automobiles, there were lots of demands for the roads to get better. So maybe even if you didn't have a car, the roads were better. So it was easier for you to travel, whether you're walking, buggy, riding a horse. And as automobiles continued to gain in popularity and more people got them, it became much easier for people to go to a doctor's office, to go to his office and see him or her. And that trend sort of continues right up into World War II, where doctors were still doing a lot of house calls, but offices were starting to come into fashion where people could go and see the doctor at his office as well. Things changed a little bit after World War II. And that's sort of when house calls really started to sort of trail off. And one of the big things that happened was advances in the medical profession and specialization within the medical field. So as technology improved for diagnostics and treatments, some of those things just couldn't be done in your home. So you had to go somewhere. Also, as doctors began to specialize, the general practitioner became less available for house calls. As the medical field specialized out, so now we have cardiologists and radiologists, their knowledge base wasn't broad enough to be able to deal with just anything that a general practitioner might encounter at someone's home. So a cardiologist probably wouldn't do general house calls because that wasn't their thing. That wasn't their specialty. So you would go to the cardiologist if you had heart problems. So that specialization sort of limited the number of doctors available for house calls, and also again made it more necessary to go to the doctor for those if you had one of those special ailments. And of course, as medicine continues to advance, again, the technology, MRI machines, chemotherapies, dialysis, a lot of these things would be really hard to do if it was in sort of a house call setting. And so house calls sort of faded away. People still do them, but not as much. Now the expectation is, with easier transportation, that the patient usually goes to the doctor or the healthcare provider. COVID changed things a little bit. To stop the spread or the potential spread of COVID, a lot of healthcare providers in some places started doing house calls again to try to contain the spread of the virus. And sort of this rebirth in house calls found that actually house calls tend to be better for the patient, and in some ways are actually cheaper for the healthcare system at large. It also kept, people sitting in waiting rooms, eliminated that, kept patients healthier, helped keep healthcare providers healthier. And so there was a bit of a resurgence. The other thing that really picked up, which is a form of health call, is telemedicine. Telemedicine has been around for a long, long time, especially for folks in rural areas that are, distances are too long to travel often. They could talk to healthcare providers on the phone or now with computers via Zoom or those applications. COVID also helped give that a kickstart again to, stop the spread of COVID by keeping people apart. Telemedicine, televisits allow doctors and healthcare providers to not only talk to patients, but with the technology we have today, to even see patients during their visits. So we've sort of come full circle, where early on house calls were pretty much the only way that you would probably see a doctor if something was wrong or if there was an emergency. That sort of faded away as trends changed, transportation improved, medical practices changed. But now with COVID, we see that there's a bit of a resurgence in house calls and re-envisioning house calls by using things like telemedicine, Zoom, to continue to provide care even when the patient can't be with the doctor or healthcare provider. So that's that in a nutshell.
Thanks for that, Mark. Yeah, it's really interesting to see how, just in, the last, little bit over a century or so, like you said there at the end, things have come full circle, and, this uptick in telehealth. I guess I thought that I didn't realize telehealth had been around longer than, just about the time that the COVID-19 pandemic has been around. Do you know how long telehealth has been happening?
I don't have the exact date, but I know that it's probably been around or been being talked about at least since the 80s.
Oh wow, okay. I didn't realize it went that far back. Wow. Yeah, because it's much. I've participated in it myself. It's much handier to just either have a phone call for a common illness. I have like a stuffy nose or maybe a cold or something, or if folks especially during the COVID-19 pandemic suspect they may have those symptoms, to have a phone call as opposed to sitting in a large waiting room with other patients. Yep. and traveling to and from. I mean, what a handy piece of technology to have, and a little bit like a form of a house call, like you mentioned.
Yep, indeed.
Really interesting to think about, sort of the full circle that it all has come. Well, Mark, I appreciate that presentation, telling us all about house calls and why they decline, and then why there's an uptick in them in recent years. Looks like we don't have any questions that have come in, but should folks have questions out there, feel free to put those in the comment section and we can address them later if you're watching the recording of this at a later time. But I want to thank Mark for taking time out of his very busy schedule at the moment, finishing up this exhibit to present this program. And just as I mentioned at the very beginning, come on out and check out the exhibit once it opens. It's opening for the first time this Saturday, May 21st from 1 to 5 p.m. The exhibit, A History of Healing Infectious Diseases and Community Responses to Defeat Them. Before we close it up, Mark, you got any final words or anything else?
No, hope folks come out and enjoy the exhibit.
Indeed. Thank you, Mark. Thanks everybody for watching. And with that, we'll see you next time.